All right. So this right here will be our last unit of new material that we'll cover, and it is on evolution. So we have made it. Congratulations. Sorry about that. So today what we're going to talk about on day one is what is evolution, the two different types of evolution that we're going to discuss during this unit, and what would have been the first organisms that would have evolved on Earth. So evolution. So basically, evolution is the gradual change in a species over many generations, and this process is going to rely on natural selection. Now, remember, the theory of evolution is going to really be based upon a gradual change over a very long period of time. A lot of students tend to get confused with the idea of, well, you know, basically whatever traits you acquire in your lifetime, you could pass on that trait to your offspring. And that's not really the case. So, an exaggerated example I typically give to students is, if you're in some type of accident and you happen to lose your arm, and then later on in life you have a child, that doesn't mean your child's going to be born without an arm because you don't have an arm. That's an acquired trait, that's an acquired condition that you have. That's not something that's passed on genetically. So, whenever we talk about how generations change, now remember, this is all going to be about traits that are passed on that give the individual an advantage. Whenever we talk about an advantage, we're really talking about kind of like in our last unit where we talked about ecosystems. So, we're talking about survival. We're talking about how does an organism compete with other organisms or even maybe the environment itself, and what traits does that organism have that give it an advantage over others. That's that whole survival of the fittest. Remember, it's all about resources, and the resources that we're talking about is food, water, shelter, space, even mating. The more advantages you have of being able to get food, have a safe place to stay, get water, have plenty of space where you feel safe at, that means that you're going to be more likely to mate and to pass on those traits. Y'all have probably heard of the term of being survival of the fittest. That's what that means. That fitness is what we're talking about there. How well can you compete and win? And as you compete and win based on environmental changes and changes that are density dependent or independent, how well can you pass on those traits and win? If a species is not able to adapt to its environment, that species will go extinct. And as those adaptations start to occur in the species that were able to adapt, the species slowly changes over time, and sometimes they'll even branch off and diverge in two different directions. So, the two types of evolution are chemical evolution and organic evolution. Now, one area where it really confuses students on this slide about chemical evolution is right here where it talks about involves the combining of inorganic molecules to make organic molecules. Whenever students see that organic molecules, they think that automatically goes with organic evolution. Organic evolution, so I want to start there. Organic evolution is actually talking about living things changing over long, hundreds of thousands of millions of years. I mean, just extremely long period of time. It can't be proven in a laboratory type setting. And so we're actually talking about living things changing, being organic. Chemical evolution is so in your junior high science classes, whenever you were talking about atoms and atoms being made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons, and then those atoms will collect together to make a molecule, kind of like water is a molecule, H2O. There's two hydrogen atoms, one oxygen atom. There's even carbon dioxide, another molecule. Those are inorganic molecules. Earlier this year, we talked about the difference between inorganic molecules and organic molecules. An inorganic molecule does not contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen together, such as H2O has hydrogen and oxygen, but it doesn't have carbon. And for organic molecules, or for CO2, now CO2 does contain carbon, which is an essential organic element, but it also needs to have hydrogen, but it only has carbon and oxygen. So whenever you're trying to define something that's been inorganic or organic, organic would be your molecules that have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. It can have other things as well. Um, so the organic molecules we're talking about are things like carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. What's important to know here conceptually is that the reason why there's two different styles of evolution here, well, organic evolution looked at how the living things change over time. But one question that science wanted to try to answer is, but where did those living things come from? So they had to look at what those living things were made of. Like your cell membrane is made up of a phospholipid. You have DNA inside the nucleus. You have proteins that are building blocks. You even have carbohydrates that are located all over it and that you use. So those are essential organic molecules. So it had to answer, well, where did those come from? If organic molecules make up cells, where did the organic ones come from? That's where this Miller-Urey experiment comes into hand. The Miller-Urey experiment is actually a scientific experiment to actually show how nature, long ago, without any presence of anything living, could have made organic molecules which are essential for creating living cells. Now, it is important to make sure that you understand that the early atmosphere and the early Earth we're not talking about dinosaur period. We're going back further than that. We're talking about like 4 billion years ago, the start of life on Earth. And actually, for chemical evolution, we're talking about even before that. So we have methane, ammonia, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and water vapor in the atmosphere. You notice there's no oxygen there. This air is actually quite poisonous, and it's just, it's really not conducive for very many living things. These are the inorganic molecules that exist in the atmosphere that's actually going to give rise to organic molecules. The Miller-Urey experiment showed how this is possible. So this is the Miller-Urey experiment. So basically, this is just a chemical experiment to test the hypothesis that inorganic molecules could form organic molecules. So right here, we'll notice where this heat source is that we have water. This water is being heated up, causing it to evaporate. It goes up this tube, and then we have a gas inlet. This gas inlet is going to add things like methane and ammonia. As it goes through this tube, it collects here in this big bulb. Now this bulb with these gases and the water vapor and the hydrogen are meant to represent our early Earth's atmosphere. These electrodes that create the spark in between it, that spark is meant to represent lightning in the sky. Well, whenever that happens, we end up getting rain, precipitation, where the water starts to cool. And as it comes down and it collects here, just like it would on Earth, like collecting in a pond or things like that, what they started noticing here is that organic molecules were forming inside this collection of water. And the main organic molecule I'm talking about is proteins, like amino acids is what we're collecting there. And so basically what they did is they took that evidence to support that, okay, well, if inorganic molecules can make organic molecules like amino acids that form to make proteins, then and organic molecules are the things that form to make cells, that's how these two processes are linked together. And so that is the Miller-Urey experiment. Remember, organic evolution is a process in which changes in the genetic composition of an organism occurs to response to the environment, but it's over extremely long periods of time. And remember, those challenges in an environment can be density dependent. That could be competition with other species, competition within the species itself for resources, or it could be caused from an independent factor, the ice age, or a comet coming to Earth that, destroys an area, or, continental drift. Those are all different types of things that would cause organisms to have to adapt. If they're unwilling to adapt, well, then they're going to go extinct. So the first organisms would have been an anaerobic heterotrophic bacteria. I will ask you that question specifically. I will also try to remind you here that bacteria, another name that we might use here, is a prokaryote. Now, if you remember, I said that there was no oxygen in the early atmosphere. That's what this anaerobic part of this first name describes. That means that this bacteria did not use oxygen to make its energy. And also, heterotrophic means that it had to get its energy from an outside source. So basically what it would do is it would eat raw materials from things around it, such as all those organic molecules that are being made. It would have eaten that. It would have eaten other anaerobic heterotrophs. The problem here is there's not enough food to go around. So they start to decline. This gives rise to another type of organism to develop through evolutionary means. So this led to an autotrophic bacteria. Remember this. We could say photosynthetic bacteria. This is a really important process. Because of this photosynthetic bacteria, we now have an organism that will take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and produce oxygen. That means that we can start having more complex aerobic organisms develop in the future, because now they can use oxygen, which is going to mean giving them a lot more energy, and so they can actually start getting larger and larger. So that would have given rise to aerobic heterotrophs. Last thing for today is endosymbiosis. Endosymbiosis can be kind of a tricky thing. So I'm going to look first over here at the image. Remember, symbiosis means to have a relationship for two different organisms to work together. Endo means it's going to happen inside of one of them. So one of them is going to be engulfed by the other. So if we look at this, the blue image here at the top, and then this red one. As we go through the timeline, we see this blue one starting to indent, but then we end up seeing this red bacterium starting to go inside of it. These are two different bacteria, and what they're actually going to do is they're actually about to develop a relationship. Now this aerobic bacteria, and remember, aerobic means it's going to use oxygen, and it's a heterotroph, and so it's going to have to break down other things to end up making its energy. So this aerobic bacteria is actually going to be able to use food that it's given by the other bacteria to make an abundance of energy, and it's going to be able to make a lot of it. Same thing starts to happen with this photosynthetic bacteria. Now that sounds a lot like the chloroplast. So plant cells would have had the mitochondria, the aerobic bacteria, and the photosynthetic bacteria. Now what this means is this actually meant that this allowed the cells to get bigger because they had way more energy they can produce. This even allowed for the development of complex eukaryotes. That's that note down here at the bottom. So the types of questions I'm going to ask you about this. I am going to ask you about the relationship between aerobic bacteria and mitochondria, just like when I asked you about photosynthetic bacteria being related to the chloroplast. And the fact that they were engulfed in that relationship increased the chance of survival for all of them. I am going to ask you about how this gives rise to eukaryotes, which are more complex. But the last thing I'm going to ask you about is what evidence do we have that supports this? Interesting thing about the organelles, your mitochondria, and the organelle, the chloroplast, which is in plants, is that it has its own DNA and it has two membranes. If you look at this, it has the membrane from the original bacteria and it has its own membrane that just covered itself. So they have two membranes and they have DNA that's unlike the DNA that's found inside of your nucleus, the host cell's nucleus. That presents the information or the idea, the hypothesis can be made that the mitochondria was once a different organism that came to be inside of the cell, but they formed a symbiotic relationship and basically lived in harmony with each other because it was like a mutualistic relationship, but one is inside the other. So I am going to ask you about that, about what evidence is there that demonstrates that this is possible. And so knowing about that DNA being similar to that of bacterial DNA, it will be very important there. Okay? So that's it for day one. I know this was pretty complicated stuff. You're probably going to want to use your review questions a lot on this right here to go over it. This is the most complicated information from this unit. Everything else is stuff that y'all kind of heard before or is a little bit easier to catch on to. This stuff right here will take some time, so be patient and go through the process of learning.